My name is Nathan Dyer, and I live in Charleston, South Carolina. I was 17 when this incident happened to me. I was going from my high school in Charleston to the old Hampton Asylum in the nearby town of Somerville. Even now, I feel a shiver run down my spine as I think about what happened on that field trip, an experience that has haunted me for years. I never expected that a school outing would turn into a nightmare that would leave me questioning reality itself. Hampton Asylum was a place we all knew about. Whispers of ghost sightings and strange occurrences circulated among the students, but we never took them seriously. The school organised a history trip there, under the guise of learning about the asylum's past as a mental institution. It was abandoned in the 1970s after a series of mysterious deaths and incidents that were never fully explained. Some of us thought it would be fun, others were skeptical, but none of us were prepared for what we would experience. As soon as we arrived, the air felt wrong, thick, heavy, and suffocating. The building loomed over us, its once grand facade now crumbling and overgrown with ivy. Our guide, a middle-aged man named Mr. Burke, seemed nervous, which put us all on edge. He took us through the dimly lit halls, describing the horrific treatments that were once practiced there. Electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and other unspeakable horrors. As we moved deeper into the asylum, I started to feel nauseous. I wasn't the only one. Several other students complained of dizziness and unease. The worst part was the silence. It was as if the building absorbed all sound, leaving only our anxious breathing and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Then we reached the isolation ward. The moment we entered, I felt a cold hand brush against my neck. I spun around, but no one was there. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to rationalize what had just happened. But when I looked at my friend Mark, his face was pale, and he was staring at the wall with wide eyes. "There's something there," he whispered. I followed his gaze and saw a faint outline, almost like a shadow, slowly materializing on the wall. It was the shape of a person, but distorted, twisted in an unnatural way. The air around it was freezing, and as it became more defined, a feeling of pure dread washed over me. The shadow seemed to be moving, reaching out toward us. Without warning, the door to the isolation ward slammed shut, trapping us inside. Panic erupted among the students as we pounded on the door, screaming for help. But the shadow continued to move, inching closer. I could hear whispers, unintelligible but filled with malice, echoing through the room. Then it happened. The lights flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I saw it, clear as day. A figure standing in the center of the room, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It was a woman, or at least what was left of one. Her face was contorted in pain, her mouth open in a silent scream. She reached out, and I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, as if I was being suffocated. When the lights came back on, the figure was gone, but the door burst open, and Mr. Burke rushed in, his face pale. He claimed the door had jammed, but we all knew something more sinister had happened. We left the asylum in a hurry, no one daring to speak about what we had seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, her eyes boring into me, accusing me, and then the nightmares started. Night after night, I would relive that moment in the isolation ward. Only in my dreams, I couldn't escape. I would wake up, gasping for air, drenched in sweat, and feeling as though someone was watching me. The following week, Mark disappeared. The police said he ran away, but I knew better. He had been obsessed with the asylum after our visit, constantly talking about the woman we had seen. The last time I spoke to him, he told me he was going back to find out what she wanted. They never found his body. Years later, I still avoid Somerville. I've tried to forget what happened, to convince myself that it was just a trick of the mind. But deep down, I know it wasn't. The Hampton Asylum took something from us that day, something we can never get back. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet, I still hear the whispers. My name is Alex, and I live in Madison, Wisconsin. I was 16 when I went on a biology field trip to Lake Winona. Our teacher, Mr. Jenkins, had planned a day of studying aquatic ecosystems, but what we encountered there was beyond anything we could have imagined. The lake had a dark history. Several children had drowned there in the 1950s, and their bodies were never recovered. Local legend had it that their spirits still lingered beneath the water's surface, waiting to pull unsuspecting victims down with them. The day started off normal enough. We arrived at the lake early in the morning, and everything seemed calm. The water was still, reflecting the grey sky above. There was a sense of tranquility, but underneath it, a strange tension that none of us could quite put our finger on. As we set up our equipment near the shore, I noticed something odd. The water, which had been clear just moments before, started to turn murky. At first, it was just a slight discoloration, but then it grew darker, almost black, as if the lake was suddenly filled with ink. Mr. Jenkins told us to stay away from the edge while he went to check the readings, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked closer, peering into the dark water. For a moment, I thought I saw something move, a flash of white just beneath the surface. My heart skipped a beat, and I leaned in for a closer look. That's when I felt it, a small, icy hand gripping my ankle. I screamed and stumbled back, falling onto the rocky shore. The water rippled where I'd been standing, but there was nothing there. My classmates rushed over, asking what had happened, but I couldn't explain it. All I could do was stare at the spot where the hand had grabbed me. Mr. Jenkins came over, annoyed at the commotion. He dismissed my experience as nerves, insisting that there was nothing in the lake that could have grabbed me, but I knew what I felt, and the coldness of that touch lingered long after. We continued with our studies, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I glanced at the lake, I saw ripples on the surface, as if something or someone was moving beneath. Then, during lunch, it happened again. One of the students, a girl named Megan, let out a blood-curdling scream. We all turned to see her standing knee-deep in the water, her face twisted in terror. Before anyone could react, she was pulled under. We rushed to the water's edge, but she was gone. The lake was still again, the dark surface betraying no sign of the struggle that had just occurred. Panic set in as we called for help, but by the time the authorities arrived, it was too late. Divers searched the lake for hours, but they found nothing. No body, no trace of Megan. It was as if she had been swallowed by the lake itself. The official report claimed she had drowned, but those of us who were there knew the truth. Something in that lake had taken her. Something that wasn't human. The school cancelled all future trips to Lake Winona, and it became a place to be avoided at all costs. But I still have nightmares about that day. I see Megan's face, hear her screams, and feel that icy grip on my ankle. And I know that whatever is in that lake is still there, waiting for its next victim. My name is Marcus, and I live in Wheeling, West Virginia. I was 18 when my class took a trip to Greenbrier High, an abandoned school that was rumoured to be haunted. The school had been shut down in the 1980s after a fire broke out, killing several students and a teacher. The cause of the fire was never determined, and the building was left to decay. It was said that the spirits of those who died in the fire still roamed the halls, trapped in the place where they met their untimely end. Our history teacher, Mrs. Franklin, thought it would be interesting for us to visit the site as part of our unit on local history. She arranged for us to tour the old building. Despite the objections of some parents, the school board gave its approval, and before we knew it, we were on our way to Greenbrier High. From the moment we arrived, I had a bad feeling. The building was in ruins, its windows shattered, and its walls covered in graffiti. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay, and the silence was unnerving. As we entered, the temperature seemed to drop, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Mrs. Franklin led us through the darkened hallways, her voice echoing as she recounted the history of the school. She pointed out where the fire had started, in the chemistry lab on the second floor. As we stood in front of the scorched doorway, I felt a sudden rush of heat, as if the flames had been reignited. I glanced at the others, but no one else seemed to notice. We continued the tour, but the further we went, the more uneasy I became. I started hearing things, faint whispers, the sound of footsteps behind us, and the occasional creak of floorboards. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but then something happened that I couldn't ignore. We were in the gymnasium, a massive space with a high ceiling and broken windows that let in the cold autumn air. The walls were lined with old trophies and faded banners, remnants of the school's former glory. As Mrs. Franklin talked about the school's sports teams, I noticed a figure standing at the far end of the gym. At first, I thought it was one of the students, but as I looked closer, I realized that it was a girl, dressed in an old-fashioned school uniform. She was staring at us with a blank expression, her eyes dark and hollow. I nudged my friend Jason, but when I turned back, she was gone. I felt a wave of nausea and stumbled back, trying to keep my composure. Jason asked what was wrong, but I couldn't find the words to explain what I had just seen. We moved on to the auditorium, and that's when things took a terrifying turn. The auditorium was pitch black, the only light coming from the open door behind us. We made our way to the stage, where Mrs. Franklin started talking about the school's drama program. As she spoke, the door slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. Panic set in as we fumbled for our flashlights. When the beams of light cut through the darkness, we saw them. Figures standing in the aisles, motionless and silent. There were dozens of them, their faces obscured by shadows. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but their presence was overwhelming. Someone screamed, and that broke the spell. We ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figures in the aisles started to move, slowly at first, but then with increasing speed. We were trapped, surrounded by these ghostly apparitions, and there was no way out. In the chaos, I felt a hand grab my arm. I turned, expecting to see one of the figures, but it was Mrs. Franklin. Her face was pale, and she was muttering something under her breath. She pushed me toward a side door that I hadn't noticed before, and we burst out into the daylight. The rest of the students followed, and we didn't stop running until we were back at the bus. No one said a word as we drove back to school. Mrs. Franklin never mentioned the incident again, and the school quietly removed Greenbrier High from the curriculum. To this day, I don't know what we encountered in that building, whether it was the spirits of the students who died in the fire or something else entirely. I can't say, but I do know that I'll never forget the fear I felt in that darkened auditorium, surrounded by those silent figures. My name is Ryan, and I live in Virginia Beach, Virginia. I was 19 when I went on a marine biology field trip to Cape Hatteras, a place notorious for shipwrecks. The graveyard of the Atlantic, they called it. Countless ships had met their end there, their remains scattered along the ocean floor. Our trip was supposed to be about studying the marine life that had taken over these wrecks, but we ended up encountering something far more terrifying. We were diving off the coast, near the remains of a ship that had gone down in the 1800s. The water was murky and visibility was low, but we could still make out the silhouette of the wreck below. Our instructor, Mr. Adams, led the way as we descended, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. As we got closer to the wreck, I started to feel uneasy. There was something about the place that felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there. The ship's twisted metal and rotting wood looked more like a tomb than a research site. I noticed that the other students were quiet too, their usual chatter replaced by a tense silence. We reached the deck of the ship, and Mr. Adams signaled for us to spread out and start our observations. I swam toward the bow, where the figurehead of the ship, a weathered mermaid, stared out into the abyss. I was about to start taking notes when I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a fish, but then I saw it again, a shadowy figure darting between the wreckage. I shone my light in that direction, but there was nothing there. The water seemed to grow colder, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I turned to signal Mr. Adams, but he was gone. In fact, I couldn't see any of the other students either. Panic set in as I realized I was alone with only the wreckage and whatever was lurking in the shadows for company. I started to swim back toward the surface, but something grabbed my leg. I looked down and saw a hand, an old, decayed hand, with flesh hanging off the bone, gripping my ankle. I kicked out, trying to free myself, but the hand tightened its grip, pulling me down. I struggled, my lungs burning as I tried to break free. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the hand let go. I shot to the surface, gasping for air. When I looked down, the water was clear, with no sign of the hand that had nearly dragged me to my death. Back on the boat, I told Mr. Adams what had happened, but he didn't believe me. He said I must have imagined it, that the pressure and the darkness had played tricks on my mind. But I knew what I felt, and the bruises on my ankle were proof that it had been real. The rest of the trip was a blur. I couldn't focus on the research, couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When we finally returned to shore, I was relieved to leave the graveyard of the Atlantic behind, but the nightmares followed me home. I would wake up in the middle of the night, feeling that hand around my ankle, pulling me down into the dark. I tried to forget about it, but the ocean has a way of reminding you of what it's taken, and sometimes, when I'm at the beach, I think I see shadows moving just below the surface, waiting for the next unsuspecting victim. My name is Brandon, and I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I was 20 when I went on a geology field trip to the Allegheny Tunnel, an old railway tunnel that had been abandoned for decades. The tunnel was known for its eerie atmosphere and strange occurrences, but our professor assured us it was just superstition. We were there to study the rock formations, not chase ghosts. The tunnel was dark and damp, with the smell of mold and rust hanging in the air. Our group of 10 students walked in single file, our flashlights barely cutting through the thick darkness. The sound of dripping water echoed through the tunnel, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. As we made our way deeper into the tunnel, I started to hear something strange, faint whispers, just at the edge of my hearing. I turned to the student behind me, but she hadn't said anything. I shook it off as nerves and kept walking. We reached the halfway point of the tunnel, where the walls were lined with old rusted tracks and decaying wooden beams. Our professor, Dr. Harris, stopped to explain the geological features of the area, but I couldn't focus on what he was saying. The whispers were getting louder, more insistent. I tried to ignore them, but they were impossible to drown out. Then, the lights went out. Our flashlights flickered and died, plunging us into complete darkness. Panic set in as we fumbled to turn them back on, but they wouldn't work. The whispers grew louder, surrounding us from all sides. I could hear voices, angry, desperate, pleading. I felt something brush past me, cold and clammy, like a hand made of fog. I jumped back, my heart racing, but there was nothing there. The other students were shouting, but their voices were drowned out by the cacophony of whispers. Then I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the tunnel, shrouded in darkness. It was tall, with long flowing robes that seemed to merge with the shadows. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me. The whispers stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that echoed through the tunnel. The figure started to move toward us, gliding across the tracks without making a sound. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure came closer, and I could see its face. Pale, hollow eyes, and a mouth twisted in a grotesque grin. It reached out with a skeletal hand, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. Just as the figure was about to touch me, the lights flickered back on. The figure vanished, and the whispers stopped as if they had never been there. The tunnel was silent again, but the fear lingered. We left the tunnel in a hurry, no one daring to speak about what had just happened. Dr. Harris tried to brush it off as a power failure, but I knew better. We had encountered something in that tunnel, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I haven't been back to the Allegheny Tunnel since that day, and I don't plan to. The experience left me shaken, and even now, I can't pass by an old railway track without feeling a sense of unease. I know that whatever is in that tunnel is still there, waiting for the next group of students to wander in, and I can only hope they make it out alive.